The recording clicked on, and my daughter-in-law's voice filled the private dining room, thin and metallic through the phone speaker, saying the words she thought no one but a nurse would ever hear. He doesn't need to know. 23 faces turned toward me at once, forks frozen halfway to open mouths, and I watched the color drain out of Vanessa's face like water finding a drain. Somewhere behind me, a detective I had met 4 days earlier stepped quietly toward the exit, blocking it without a word. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the silence do what 11 months of patience had built it to do. Before I tell you what happened after that silence broke, and it did break, spectacularly tell me where you're watching this from tonight, drop it in the comments below, and if you believe family should never be allowed to weaponize a hospital bed, hit that like button and subscribe, because you're going to want to see this play out all the way to the end. To understand how we got here, we have to go back 11 months. On Tuesday afternoon, a nurse read me a phone message that was never meant for my ears. My name is Harold James Whitfield. I was 71 years old that spring, a retired forensic accountant who had spent 32 years at Meridian Trust Bank combing through other people's numbers, hunting for the one decimal point that didn't belong. I had built a quiet, orderly life out of patterns, the way a fraudulent invoice always breathed a little differently than a real one, the way a falsified signature always pressed too hard in exactly the wrong place. I never imagined I would need those particular instincts inside my own family. I assumed, the way most fathers assume, that the danger in my life would come from strangers. I was wrong, and the cost of being wrong very nearly killed me. My son, Daniel, married Vanessa Cole 9 years before any of this began. I liked her, in the beginning. She was polished and quick and knew how to fill a silence at holiday dinners. It was only in the last 2 years, after my wife Eleanor died of a stroke on a Sunday morning in March, that I started noticing the small currents underneath Vanessa's charm, the way she asked about my accounts a little too casually, the way she began referring to my modest house on Larkspur Lane as the property instead of your home. I told myself it was nothing. Grief makes a man doubt his own eyes. I did not yet understand that grief had also made me, for the first time in my life, a target. The wound opened on a Thursday in September. I went to transfer $800 from my retirement account to cover a furnace repair and found, instead, a balance that told me something had gone catastrophically wrong. $128,443.17, the exact sum that had sat in that account for 6 years, untouched, my cushion against exactly this kind of emergency, was simply gone. Not gone gradually. Gone in a single wire transfer, dated the 11th of July, authorized by a power of attorney document I had never signed, granting Vanessa Cole Whitfield full financial authority over my affairs. My signature was on it. It was a good forgery. It was not, however, good enough to fool a man who had spent 3 decades deciding whether signatures were real for a living. I confronted them 2 nights later, over a dinner Vanessa had cooked herself, chicken with rosemary, a dish she only made when she wanted something. I laid the bank statement on the table between the wine glasses and asked, as calmly as I could manage, where my money had gone. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Vanessa did. She looked at me with an expression of wounded patience, the kind you'd use on a confused child, and she said the money had been moved to protect me from scammers targeting seniors, that she'd meant to tell me sooner but hadn't wanted to worry me while I was still grieving Eleanor, that after everything they did for me, the groceries, the rides to appointments, the countless hours, she was hurt I would even question her. It was, I will admit, a beautifully constructed lie. Smooth at every seam. I felt something cold settle into my chest as I listened, the particular stillness of a man watching a familiar pattern complete itself in front of him. I said I understood. I thanked her for looking out for me. Inside, I had already begun building the case. I spent the next several weeks playing a part one had never rehearsed for, the fading, forgetful old man. I misplaced my keys in front of them on purpose. I asked Daniel the same question about the weather twice in one visit. I let a little tremor creep into my hands when Vanessa was watching. Meanwhile, in private, I was doing what I had always done best. I called Marguerite Alvarez, a forensic accountant I'd trained 22 years earlier, and asked her, off the books, to pull the wire transfer records and trace the receiving account. I met with an elder law attorney named Preston Yates in a coffee shop 40 minutes from my house, somewhere no one from my family would recognize me, and handed him copies of the forged power of attorney. I installed a small camera, no larger than a thumbnail, in the smoke detector above my kitchen table. The same kind of hidden observation point I'd once used to catch a branch manager skimming from elderly clients' accounts. I told no one. Not Daniel, not my sister, not my closest friend from the accounting firm. A wolf does not announce the trap it is building. It waits, and it watches, and it lets the prey believe the field is still open. The second wound came 4 months later, in January, and it was worse than the first by an order of magnitude I hadn't anticipated. Marguerite's trace on the wire transfer led not to a savings account but to a shell company called Larkspur Holdings, named, with a cruelty I still find breathtaking, after the very street I lived on. The company had been formed 6 weeks before the transfer, and its sole listed officer was a man named Curtis Renfro, who turned out to be a self-styled senior care consultant with 2 prior fraud complaints filed against him in another state, both quietly settled, neither resulting in charges. Renfro's business model, Preston Yates explained to me over a second cup of coffee, was elegant in its predation. He embedded himself with families managing aging parents, offered to streamline finances and paperwork, and skimmed a commission from every account he helped drain. He was, in every sense that mattered, a vulture who had found an easy carcass in my family's greed. But it was the hidden camera that delivered the blow that nearly stopped my recovering heart. 3 weeks after I learned Renfro's name, I watched a recording of Vanessa and Daniel at my own kitchen table, believing themselves alone, discussing a psychiatric evaluation they intended to arrange for me, a wellness check they would frame as concern, designed to produce a diagnosis of diminished capacity that would let them petition for full guardianship over my finances and my medical decisions. Vanessa's exact words, time-stamped at 9:47 in the evening on the 18th of January, were that once I was declared incompetent, the house, the remaining accounts, and Eleanor's life insurance payout of $209,000 would be fully theirs to manage, with no further need for my cooperation or my signature. 2 days after that recording, my cardiologist told me I needed open-heart surgery within 6 weeks or risk a fatal cardiac event. I understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a man staring down 2 forms of death at once, exactly what my surviving the operation might cost them, and exactly what my not surviving it might be worth. I decided to set a trap of my own. I told Vanessa, in a voice I made deliberately tremble, that I had drafted a new will the week before, one that left everything, the house, the remaining investments, Eleanor's insurance money, solely to Daniel, cutting her out entirely in case anything happened to us, and that the document was locked in the top drawer of my study desk. There was no such will. There was only a blank folder and a second hidden camera, this one disguised inside a small desk clock I'd bought for exactly that purpose. 4 days later, the footage showed Vanessa alone in my study at 11 at night, photographing the empty folder with her phone, then calling Curtis Renfro and telling him, in words I will not forget, that they needed to move faster and that a hospital stay would be the cleanest way to buy time before I could change anything back. 2 days after that call, I received a notice from my surgeon's office that my pre-operative appointment had been rescheduled. When I called to ask why, a nurse, kindly, and without any idea of the damage she was about to do to a scheme 11 months in the making, read me back a note from my file. Vanessa had called the surgical coordinator directly and told her that the family had decided to postpone the operation for personal reasons, and that I was not to be informed of the change until they had consulted further, because, in the nurse's own reading of the note, he doesn't need to know. That was the moment the last piece locked into place. I understood, finally and completely, that this had never been about protecting me from a scam. It had been about controlling the clock on my death. I did not confront them. I called Preston Yates and Marguerite Alvarez and told them it was time. I called the detective handling elder financial exploitation cases in our county, a measured, unhurried man named Anthony Cho, and handed him copies of everything: the forged power of attorney, the wire transfer records, the shell company documents, the recordings from both cameras, and the hospital's own note confirming the surgery had been secretly cancelled without my knowledge or consent. Detective Cho told me it was one of the more thoroughly documented cases of elder financial abuse he had seen cross his desk in 11 years on the force. I told him I had 32 years of practice building exactly this kind of case, and that I intended to close it properly, in front of everyone who needed to see it closed. I chose Daniel's promotion dinner as the stage, 3 weeks later, in a private room at the restaurant where Eleanor and I had celebrated our 40th anniversary. 23 people were there: cousins, old family friends, Daniel's colleagues. Detective Cho sat 2 tables back, dressed for a dinner he had no intention of eating. When the toasts finished and the room quieted, I stood, thanked everyone for coming, and said there was one more piece of business before dessert. I played the recording of the kitchen conversation about the psychiatric evaluation and the guardianship. I played the desk clock footage of Vanessa photographing an empty folder. And then I played the final clip, a call recorded, with Detective Cho's guidance and full legal authorization, only 4 days earlier, in which Vanessa, believing she was speaking privately to Curtis Renfro about accelerating Phase 2, said the 6 words that would end her freedom for longer than she expected. He doesn't need to know anything. A hospital administrator I had quietly invited, a woman named Beatrice Solomon who had reviewed the falsified surgical consent on her own initiative once I raised my concerns, confirmed to the stun table that the cancellation of my operation had never been authorized by me and had, in fact, been logged under a signature that did not match my own. Detective Cho stood. He did not need to say much. The room did the rest of the work for him. What happened in the next 90 seconds was the part one had least been able to predict, and the part one found, privately, the most satisfying. Daniel turned on Vanessa before the detective had even finished reading her rights, his voice cracking as he insisted he had only gone along with the psychiatric evaluation idea, that the wire transfer and the shell company had been entirely her arrangement with Renfro. Vanessa, in turn, screamed that Daniel had known about every dollar and had simply been too cowardly to sign anything himself, and that Curtis Renfro had promised her the whole scheme was airtight. Renfro, arrested separately 2 days later at a storage unit in the next county where investigators found records tying him to 4 other elderly victims, offered no loyalty to either of them once he understood the recordings existed. 3 cornered animals, each certain the others would take the fall, turned their teeth on one another the instant the trap sprang shut. I watched it happen the way I once watched fraud cases unravel at Meridian Trust, with no pleasure in cruelty, only the quiet, exhausted relief of a math problem finally, correctly solved. 6 months passed before I could say the worst of it was truly behind me. My surgery, rescheduled under my own authority and with Beatrice Solomon personally overseeing the paperwork, went smoothly, and I recovered in a hospital room with no hidden agendas attached to the visitor's log. Marguerite Alvarez helped me recover $91,000 of the missing $128,000 through the shell company's frozen assets. The remainder I chose not to chase further, and instead donated $11,000 of the recovered sum to the cardiac care unit that had saved my life, in Eleanor's name, with a small plaque that now hangs in the surgical waiting room. Vanessa pled guilty to elder financial exploitation and forgery and was sentenced to 4 years, with restitution ordered on top of what Marguerite had already clawed back. Daniel avoided prison but lost his job once the case became public, and the marriage ended before her sentencing hearing was even scheduled. I rebuilt my days around smaller, steadier things: Sunday calls with my sister, mornings in Eleanor's garden, which I had let go to seed during the worst of the deception and brought carefully back to life that following spring. 14 months after that dinner, Vanessa showed up at my door, out on parole, thinner than I remembered, asking to talk. She said she was sorry, that she had let desperation and Renfro's promises cloud her judgment, that she hoped, someday, I might find a way to let her back into what remained of the family. I stood in my doorway and looked at her for a long moment, the same stillness I'd felt at that dinner table settling back into my chest. I told her I hoped she rebuilt whatever life she could for herself, and that I meant that sincerely. Then I told her the door behind me was closing, permanently, and that no apology delivered after the fact could undo a plan to profit from my death. I did not raise my voice. I closed the door. Blood may open a door for you once. It will not keep that door open through betrayal, and it should never have to. Loyalty is not owed to a name, it is earned, day after day, in the small honest moments no one is recording. So let me ask you, if you discovered tomorrow that someone in your own family was quietly counting down to your absence, would you have the patience to build your case in silence, the way I did, or would you confront them the moment you knew? Tell me in the comments below, and if this story keeps you watching until the very end, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories like this one still to come.